Chapter 10. It's probably the same for policemen who stand duty at football matches. On the pitch in front of them, 22 highly paid experts are putting on an exhibition of the very greatest science and skill the game affords, pulling off shots that extremely boring people will discuss in pubs for the next 20 years. But the policemen aren't interested. They probably don't like football, hate standing around in the open air for hours on end, and wish they were back home with a nice cup of tea watching the ballet on Channel 4. Completely wasted on them the whole show. So with Paul. Even he sensed that the display of sword fighting, of which he was a very unwilling spectator, was something quite out of the ordinary. The jumping, ducking, prancing, swishing about, blade clashing, flying sparks, and bad language were all evidently Olympic standard, and then some. Paul, on the other hand, just wished they'd go away and do it somewhere else, where there'd be less risk of a careless backhand slash slicing him in two. He'd have followed his instinct, shut his eyes and curled up into a little hedgehog-style ball on the floor, if it hadn't been for the extreme surrealism of the thing, which gripped his attention in spite of everything. No doubt about it, utterly improbable as it may seem, the tall skinny bloke giving Ricky Wormtorter such a very hard time out there was unquestionably Paul Carpenter. It was a curious feeling, watching himself fight. It wasn't an activity he'd ever had the slightest desire to indulge in, and his knowledge of it matched his enthusiasm. But there he was, plain as the nose on their mutual face, hacking and hewing and slashing, to the point where Ricky Wormtorter, who was presumably pretty good at that sort of thing, was starting to look decidedly harassed. That's me, Paul thought, as another shower of sparks blossomed out of the collision of the two blades. I'm doing that. It surely added another penumbra of terror to the proposition that he had always been his own worst enemy. Ricky was getting tired. He was sweating. His movements were growing jerkier and more desperate. He was puffing like a fat man on an exercise bicycle, and he was trying all those stunts that Kirk and Errol and Bert pull off in the movies, but which don't actually work. Jumping up on the furniture, weaving in and out of shelf units, ducking behind freestanding lampstands. Any minute now, Paul thought. And sure enough, Ricky ducked out of the way of a huge lunge with micromillimeters to spare, sprang up in the air and grabbed for the light fitting, presumably with a view to swinging across the room over his enemy's head towards the door and safety. But of course there are things that Errol and Sean and even Mel and Pierce can get away with on the silver screen, but which you should not try at home. For a split second Ricky hung in midair, an electric flex stripped of its insulation in one hand, a steel sword in the other, and then he dropped like a dead spider and thudded heavily on the floor. Immediately, sword fighter Paul was standing over him, sword raised for the kill. Real Paul couldn't bear to look. He turned his head to the wall, waiting for that tearing, slicing sound he'd only heard in butcher's shops, and instead heard a piercing female yell. He looked up and saw that his other self had inadvertently trodden on Sophie's outstretched ankle. Shit, he thought. Even she couldn't sleep through that. And when she woke up, Swordfighter Paul hesitated, the sword still hanging in the air above his head, and that was all the reprieve that Ricky needed. In the time it would take a camera to snap a picture at noon on a hot summer day, he had scuttled between Swordboy's legs and shot away behind a bank of file stacks. Swordboy lunged after him like a pouncing cat, with the result that, at that precise moment, when Sophie's eyes opened, the first person she saw wasn't Ricky, or even the ninja doppelganger. Before Paul could look away or do anything, their eyes met, and you could practically see the pink filter come down behind them, like the safety curtain in a theatre. Though they were too far away to hear it, a nightingale sang in Berkeley Square, and Paul gazed deep into the eyes of the only girl he'd ever really loved, saw in them the deep glow of the same fire that burned so fiercely in his soul, and thought, bullshit, bugger, because only a few minutes ago Sophie had told him that she loved him, and now she still loved him, almost certainly a whole lot more, but entirely because she'd just drunk a tumblerful of J.W. Wells' world-famous infallible, all-conquering love filter, which meant, of course, that he was now ineffably screwed. Sophie didn't seem aware of the ear-splitting bangs, crashes, thumps, clangs and crunching noises issuing from behind the file shelves. She only had eyes and ears for him. She gazed at him, her lips trembling. "Paul," she said huskily. "Shh," Paul hissed back. "Sorry, darling." "Shit," Paul thought. Creme de menthe and diarrhea sauce with a tossed salad. Look, he said desperately as a wild thought crossed his mind. We've got to get out of here, right?
Anything you say, darling.
That was when the file stack collapsed. It had every right, given that Ricky, wouldn't you just know he was a B-movie buff, had just kicked it over under the misguided impression that it would help matters. It didn't, of course. All it achieved was an avalanche of alphabetically ordered buff folders, which engulfed Sophie like the lava stream from a volcano. A moment later, Ricky and psychotic Paul fell on top of the pile. Both of them had lost their swords. Ricky had hold of his opponent's wrist, while Psycho Paul was trying to skewer him with a long knife, with every prospect of success. Not that the real Paul really gave a damn one way or the other. But if they weren't careful where they rolled and thrashed about, Sophie was going to get squashed like a fly on a windscreen, and he wasn't having that. Excuse me, he said. Predictably, they took no notice, all wrapped up in each other like a pair of amorous teenagers. Paul tried clearing his throat loudly, but that had no effect. So he got up, strolled round the back of the trash file stack, looked around until he found the 2 discarded swords and picked them up. Excuse me, he repeated. Then he slammed the flat of the sword in his right hand across the shoulder blades of his mirror self. That was a rather weird feeling too, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to hit Ricky, partly because he was so obviously losing, partly from some lingering vestige of respect or fear, whereas beating up on himself was, after all, something he'd been doing for years in one way or another. That got through in a way that mere words couldn't. Sword Boy clearly had all the right instincts for someone in his line of business. As soon as he became aware of the potential danger, he didn't muck about yelling or turning around. Instead, he shot forward, using Ricky's face in roughly the same way that a sprinter uses the starting blocks, landed on his feet and threw the big knife in his right hand as he turned. Paul watched it coming straight at him for a very long fraction of a second. He had time to think about the nasty mess he was in and even analyse the various wrong turnings and mistakes he'd made that had fetched him up here. If only, he concluded, I'd paid more attention in school. I could have got better exam results, decent qualifications. Right now I'd be sitting behind a desk doing grossing up calculations for advanced corporation tax, not watching a dirty great knife spinning through the air right at me. Miss Huck told me I'd regret it. I wonder how she knew. The knife missed. Odd that. Alternative Paul didn't look like the sort of man who was capable of missing a fairly straightforward shot like that, even if he wanted to. Maybe he was having a bad day. Makes 2 of me, Paul thought sourly. Or maybe deep down he still had a shred of the Carpenter decency and reluctance to shed blood. Or not. A moment later, Alt Paul had jumped over Ricky like the cow in the nursery rhyme, grabbed the sword out of Paul's left hand, and driven it hard into the floorboards, in the spot that Ricky's head had just vacated. Ricky, meanwhile, was on his feet and hurtling towards the door. Alt Paul howled something in a language Paul didn't recognise and went after him, as close on his heels as a very angry shadow. He didn't bother closing the door after him. Clearly, good manners, as well as regard for the value of human life, was something he didn't share with his identical twin. Paul sat down on the only unsmashed chair, dropping the other sword on the floor with a clang. He had no idea what the hell all that had been about, but at least it appeared to have gone away. For now, anyway. And that was one of those small mercies he was always being urged to be grateful for. He took a couple of deep breaths to steady himself, and turned his head to look at the mountain of dislodged files under which, presumably, Sophie was fast asleep. Fine, he thought. Now comes the difficult bit. After a good long rummage, Paul found Sophie's shoulder. He recognised it by feel. Thin, bony. He shook it. Soph?
Don't call.
She sat up, files tumbling off her like snow from the branches of a tree.
Darling,
she said. Oh well, Paul thought. There'd been a tiny spark of hope in the back of his mind. She'd wake up and the bash on the head would have cured her of the effect of the filter, or something like that. No chance.
Jesus,
she added in a slightly less soppy voice.
My head hurts. What the hell's been going on?
Several things, Paul replied economically, and I'll tell you later. Right now, though, we need to leave. Turns out that Ricky's a baddie after all. As he said them, the words didn't sound right. Not a baddie as such. If Psycho Boy caught up with Ricky and succeeded in chopping him into slices, you wouldn't find the words really evil printed all the way through, like Seaside Rock. An arsehole, yes. The sort of really unpleasant person who'd dump all over any number of harmless bystanders in order to save his own skin. But that was about it, and most people could end up like that, given a thoroughly horrible set of circumstances. But not me, Paul realised with a jolt. Apparently not me. Well, there you go.
My God,
Sophie was saying.
That's terrible. Did he try and hurt you, darling? I'll kill him.
Paul shook his head. Don't bother, he said. There's another nutcase on the loose, trying to do just that. Hence, he added, indicating the trashed room, the makeover. They've buggered off, but they may come back. I think we should leave before they do. Sophie nodded vigorously.
Of course,
she said, and took his hand to help herself get up. She was probably a bit absent-minded from concussion or something, because she forgot to let go of it once she was on her feet.
Who was the other man? Do you know?
Excellent question. No idea, Paul said. Like it matters. Let's get out of here.
Right, where to?
Where indeed? Oh, for a portable door or something of the kind. He looked down at his left hand, which was still full of sword. In particular, he noticed the satin-brown gleam of the blade, the sparkle as the light played on the silver patterns set deep in the heart of the steel. Well, he thought, why not? It worked before. So did helicopters, and Harrier jets, and space shuttles, but it helped if you knew how to make them go. Paul looked at the sword, just in case there was something helpful written on it in very small letters. But if there was, he missed it. Quite possibly using a living blade to skip across dimensional interfaces was yet another useful piece of knowledge they'd covered in Miss Hook's class, only he'd been too busy making paper aeroplanes to listen. Vicky knew, he assumed. Probably Mr. Lairtides, Mr. Tanner, maybe Mr. Tanner's mum, Professor Van Spee undoubtedly knew, and so did Ricky Wormtorter. Quite possibly everybody in the world except him. Everybody? Sophie, he said, you wouldn't by any chance happen to know how to use a magic sword to transcend the elements, would you? Only... She nodded eagerly.
Funny you should say that, because I was tidying Van Spee's desk for him, and there was a photocopy of an article about it. Actually, it's really, really simple. All you have to do is get the sword and do a sort of sideways swish like this.
Here, Paul said. Show me what you mean. You can use this one if you like.
All right, but you better stand back. I don't want to cut you in two accidentally. There was a diagram. It's kind of like a rising sideways... The sword glittered for a split second and then vanished, taking Sophie with it. Paul sighed. At least she was safer now, and he wouldn't have to worry about her getting caught in the crossfire, while he, why me, he demanded of the universe at large, why fucking me, did what little he could do to straighten things out a bit. Paul frowned. He'd forgotten something. Not that it was terribly important, but good manners always mattered regardless. He smiled. Hi, Colin, he said. Fuck you, Colin the Goblin replied, scrambling up off the floor. Look, I'm getting sick and tired of this. You and your girlfriend want to play virtual revolving doors. Find some other poor sod. Paul sighed. He no longer had a sword, but he had a severely frayed temper, and Colin was, after all, shorter than he was. Grabbing the Goblin by the shirt front, he heaved. To his great surprise, he actually managed to lift him an inch or two off the floor. Be quiet, he said. Colin started as though he'd just been gored by Bambi. Sorry, he mumbled. Only, would you mind putting me down? Heights make me dizzy, see? Paul sighed and let him go. You'll have to excuse me, he said. I'm having a rather trying day. Did you get them? Get what? The crystals. Colin wasn't a very good liar. No, he said. Didn't get round to it, sorry. At least I went and had a good rummage around in your desk drawers, but... Hand them over. Oh, all right. Colin fished the bottle out of his pocket. Only you promised. I only want a tiny bit, Paul reassured him. You can keep the rest. You sure? Paul took the bottle out of his hand and unscrewed the lid. One other thing, he said. You'll have to stay here for a bit until I've sorted things out. We apologise for any inconvenience. Hey, but, Paul went on, if my theory's correct, this dimension, or whatever it is, contains all the inanimate objects in the world and no people. So it occurs to me that a dishonest person could probably find ways of occupying his time if he got stranded here for a while. That's no comfort to you, of course, but I thought I'd mention it. It's purely out of interest. Colin went all quiet and thoughtful for a moment. Well, he said, I can see why you want me to stay here, so your lady friend won't get pulled across when I leave. In what the heck, I can sit and read a book or something, right? Paul clamped his hand tight around the pinch of crystals he'd taken from the bottle. That's very considerate of you, Colin. Now, please go away. Anything you say? The Goblin waddled towards the door, then stopped.
I don't suppose you got such a thing as a jemmy or a pair of bolt cutters on you by any chance? Only sometimes you get a book where the pages have all got stuck together and... Goodbye, Colin. Cheerio, then. See you around.
Left alone, Paul sat cross-legged on the floor and tried to think. His mind was so full of weirdness that concentrating was like trying to drink with chopsticks, but gradually he began to patch together a plan of action. It wasn't exactly wonderful, but it was the best he could do, and as such a marginal improvement on bugger all. He stood up, found a piece of paper, a single sheet of A4, a copy of an invoice to Mr. D. Gray in respect of cleaning and restoring one portrait, and folded it neatly around the crystals, forming a small envelope which he tucked into his top pocket. It was perfectly simple. All he had to do was find Ricky Wormtorder, challenge him to a duel to the death, and kill him. Once he'd done that, everything would gradually unravel, and the rest of his day would be his own. Either that, or he'd be seeing Mr. Dow again very soon, and maybe he'd be in time to enrol in the flower-arranging evening class, although he had an idea it'd get boring after a while. Only so many things you can do with lilies, after all. With this aim in view, Paul set off to find his prey. Tracking him turned out to be pretty straightforward. All he had to do was follow the trail of hacked doors, trashed computer terminals, lacerated soft furnishings, and viciously mutilated office furniture. There was, of course, the rather nasty thought that he'd be too late. When last seen, Ricky had barely been holding his own against the other Paul Carpenter, and that had been some time ago. If Ricky was already dead, Paul was probably screwed. Alternatively, if Ricky had somehow contrived to kill the other Paul, he didn't want to think about that. The ramifications were practically two simultaneous quadratic equations, and maths was yet another subject he'd let slide past him during his early youth. He quickened his step a little, occupying his mind with a selection of small, trivial practicalities, such as what he was proposing to use as a weapon, now that Sophie had taken the living sword back with her to real space. Thus diverted, Paul wasn't paying much attention to where he was going. He turned a corner and walked straight into something chunky. Turned out to be a small, bald man with an almost perfectly spherical head. "Hello, Paul," he said. It was as though the collision had physically jolted a component part of his mental jigsaw into place. He stared at the man for a moment and then blurted out, "You're not human!" "Never said I was, Paul." Now he came to mention it, he still didn't have the faintest idea what the bald man was, only what he wasn't. "You're a friend of Mr. Laytide's," he said. "More than a friend," the man replied, grinning. "You're a smart kid. Well, no you aren't, but you got there in the end." "It was you, though," Paul replied doggedly. "I kept meeting you everywhere, and I thought I recognised you, but each time you were someone different. And then," he added, "you gave me the custard slice, the one with the poison in it that killed Ricky, back on the other side." "Guilty as charged," the round-headed man grimaced. "Sorry about that, but yeah, essentially you're on the right track. I can't be human, because this place is uninhabited apart from a few trespassers who've somehow got hold of Van Spee's crystals. Is that what you were about to say?" Something like that." In that case, 7 out of 10. Now listen," the man added, taking Paul by the elbow in a wholly unthreatening manner. "I just popped across to give you something." He stuck his fingers up his left sleeve like an elderly lady reaching for her hanky and teased out a perfectly ordinary blue toothbrush. "It's the one I sold you, back when you came into my shop in Aldgate. Frank feels it might come in handy when you run into Dietrich Wormtorder." Paul took the brush from him and looked at it. "Thanks," he said. "Just what I need. Now I can club him senseless with the butt end and floss him to death." The bald man considered that. "I suppose," he said, "but it's a bit on the elaborate side, if you ask me. You'll probably do better if you just tap the handle in the palm of your hand 3 times and think of Christmas cake." "Christmas?" "Well, it's what I do. Really, it's just to clear your mind. Go on, try it." Feeling rather silly, Paul did as he'd been told. Tap, tap, tap. Dark brown cake the consistency of fire brick, pebble dashed with hard nuggets of petrified currants and glacé cherries. Yum. The toothbrush twitched slightly in his hand and morphed into an assault rifle. "There you go," the bald man said. "Swords and stuff are fine if you're a top-flight fencer, but for the novice you can't beat a plain old M16. M16, Paul repeated. "That's the one that goes from Gould to Rotherham via Doncaster, right?" "If you say so," replied the bald man tolerantly. Now, to make it work, you press that bit there. The bullets come out at the end with the hole in it. That's quite important, so be careful. If you pull the trigger and nothing happens, your best bet is to run away, whimpering. All right?
I guess so, Paul said. Thanks, he added. Are you sure it works against, well, heroes and the like? I mean, don't they have special magic stuff that means the bullets just bounce off? The bald man looked up and pursed his lips.
You know, he said, now that you mention it, I believe they do. Some of them anyway. On the other hand, not many of them know that, so you may be able to bluff your way. See you later, he concluded.
Maybe, he added. Just a second, Paul called him back. Suppose I do kill Ricky Wormtotal. What happens then?
Well, for a start, you can nick his stapler and sellotape dispenser. Probably you'd have to cover at least part of his workload until they get a replacement. But I expect Benny Shumway will do most of the complicated stuff, and otherwise...
Just what I need at this point, Paul thought sadly. A comedian. Thanks anyway, he said. I don't suppose you'd consider telling me who you really are? The bald man smiled.
Sure, I'll consider it. There, done that. Now, be seeing you.
Surprising himself with the speed of his own reactions, 3 years of compulsory tennis at school and he'd never actually hit the ball once. Apparently he'd improved since then. Paul grabbed for the bald man's windpipe, but his fingers closed on empty air, and a thoroughly unpleasant buzzing sensation ran down his arm as far as his elbow, something like an electric shock. Well, it was an answer of sorts. He lifted the rifle in his left hand and looked at it with mild distaste. It was lighter than he'd expected. Rather tinny and plasticky and cheap and nasty looking, and he didn't really trust it not to go off of its own accord if he bumped into something or dropped it. On the other hand, it was the only friend he had in this dimension, as against two extremely hostile and athletic enemies. Here's looking at you, kid, he muttered. If he didn't have enough to put up with, Paul also had a vague but alarming feeling that he was lost. Edging along the corridor, sketchy memories of how Starsky and Hutch used to do it, but he couldn't have remembered right because he kept tripping over his feet. He came to a fire door. He nudged it open with his foot and charged, just as the automatic door closer brought it sharply back onto the tip of his nose. He dropped the rifle and hopped about on one foot for a while, then went back, opened the door properly, and went through. He found himself in a passageway that he couldn't recall having been in before. Nothing new there. 70 St. Maryacks belonged to the TARDIS School of Architecture at the best of times, as he'd found out on a number of occasions when late for a meeting or an appointment. There was nothing overtly threatening or weird about this passageway. It was carpeted in hard-wearing beige Axminster. The doors were plain white with aluminium handles, and there were framed prints of the Lake District on the walls. But it seemed to go on for rather a long time, straight as a Roman road, windowless. At last he decided he couldn't take much more. He stopped, chose a door at random, and went in. The room Paul found himself in was small, window-deficient and empty, apart from a plastic stacking chair, a rather battered old desk, a telephone and a waste paper basket. There was a thin layer of dust on the desktop. Paul was something of an expert where dust was concerned. At home he could sit and look at it for hours, and often did, and in his considered opinion, the desk hadn't seen the fighting surface of a duster for about a month. Fine, he thought, just an empty office. No big deal. Anyhow, he wasn't going to find what he wanted here. He turned to leave and found that the door wasn't there anymore. Don't you just hate it when that happens? Paul had been in this situation before. Not long after he joined the firm, he'd been trapped in his own flat for an indeterminate length of time, though nothing like as long as the two clerks had been marooned in the same flat for over a century. In the end, he'd managed to rescue them both, and one of them was now married to Mr. Tanner's mum, so the situation wasn't inherently hopeless. Even so, he picked up the telephone. No purr or buzz. It didn't work or wasn't connected, which didn't surprise him at all. He put it down, sighed, and sat in the chair, staring at the patch of wall where the door had once been. He hadn't forgotten that he still had the pinch of Van Spee's crystals in his top pocket. They could get him out of this dimension and back to real space, but there was no guarantee that that would be much help. If, as he'd been led to believe, Custard space was identical in every respect to the real thing except for the absence of life forms, if he gobbled the crystals and went back, he'd still be trapped in a disused office without a door. Briefly, he considered shooting a hole in the wall with the rifle, but didn't like the idea much. Knowing his luck, either the wall would take no notice, or else the whole building would come down around his ears. "Hello," said a voice about 9 inches from his ear. "Who are you?" Paul didn't jump or even flinch. He was getting used to unexplained, unexpected voices. He looked round to see who'd spoken, and saw. Later, he realised what it reminded him of. The colouring books he'd been given as a child, where there'd been black and white outlines of things and people, which he'd filled in with his crayons and felt tips. The woman was just such an outline. He could see the opposite wall through her, but he could also see her shape quite clearly. Her head, arms, body, down to the waist, where she disappeared behind a desk. With a big box and crayons and enough time, he could colour her in, and then she'd probably exist. "Hello," Paul replied. Are you a ghost?" She laughed. "I suppose I am," she said, "although actually it's a bit offensive calling me that. It's not terribly PC. Sorry," Paul said. What ought I to call you?" "The preferred term," she replied gravely, "is consultant. Not that any of them use it. Dennis Tanner calls me spiritware, or at least that's how I'm described in the accounts, though I'm down in the books as a fixed asset, which can't be all bad. Humphrey Wells calls me that bitch, but we never did get on. Judy doesn't call me anything. Wild horses wouldn't drag her in here. Kaz Suslovich calls me Mr. Gauslin. He's always very polite and proper. Dietrich Wormtoter calls me Tony, which I really don't care for very much. You can call me Antonia if you like. Who are you?" Paul Carpenter," Paul replied. Pleased to meet you." Antonia smiled. At least 2 thin black lines in thin air curved. "Likewise," she said. "Who are you? You're a bit young to be a partner. Are you a clerk?" Paul nodded. Junior clerk," he said. "At least, I was. Don't know what I am now. I was working for Mr. Lairtides as his assistant, but that's all a bit complicated, really." "That's all right," she said. "This is friendly small talk, not a police investigation. You don't know who I am, do you?" Paul shook his head. "But don't read anything into that," he added, "because I've only been here less than a year, and I've never even been down this corridor before." "Well, of course you haven't. You don't know what the corridor is either, do you?" Actually, no." "This," Antonia said, "is death row. No, don't worry. It's not like that. It's just sort of nickname. This is where all the ex-partners have their offices, you see." Ex-partners?" Paul repeated. If that's an explanation, I guess I must be too thick to understand it." Antonia giggled. "Quite all right," she said. "Ex is just a polite way of saying dead. You see, when you get made a partner in J.W. Wells, you have to sign a partnership agreement, and the terms and conditions are pretty, well, strict, really. Basically, unless the partners decide to throw you out on your ear for stealing money or something, once a partner, always a partner, and they don't let you off the hook just because your body eventually wears out and you die. You just get moved to a smaller office, like this one." Paul frowned. Then he opened his mouth and closed it again. "Other firms have sleeping partners," Antonia went on. "That's where you don't do any work, but you still get a share of the money. We've got the opposite. We don't get paid, but the contract says we still have to work. So they shunt us up here in Theo Van Spee's artificial dimension, where the rules aren't quite the same. And that, by the way, is why you never found this part of the building before, if you've only been here in ordinary space. It's all rather clever, really," she said, with just the very faintest hint of bitterness. "At the time when you sign on, you think, gosh, that's wonderful. It's as good as being immortal. But after a while," she sighed, "my speciality is applied numerology. That's doing magic with numbers, which is just another way of saying I'm an accountant. And you don't have to be alive to be an accountant. In fact, in many ways, it's a positive drawback. So here I am, 37 years after I died, still plugging quietly away." Paul stared at her for a while, and then said, "Oh, that puts it very neatly," Antonia replied. "Actually, it's not that bad. Before, you see, my friends all used to say to me, 'Come on, Antonia, get a life,' and it always used to make me feel just a little bit guilty because I was always so busy, never had time to get round to it. But now there's just work, and nobody gives me a hard time about working evenings and weekends and holidays and Christmas anymore, and mostly it feels the same, except I don't get hungry or cold or tired, and my feet don't go to sleep when I've been sitting still for hours on end. In a way, I suppose it's an improvement. For an accountant, death is a form of evolution. At least, she added sadly, that's what I tell myself sometimes. The rest of the time I sit here and do the numbers. That's, Paul said, and left it there. There was only so much you could say in words. Anyhow, Antonia said briskly, that's enough about me. What are you doing here? Did Theo send you to fetch something? Paul shook his head. It's a long story, he said. Antonia clapped the outlines of her hands together. Splendid, she said. Start at the beginning and go very slowly. It'll make it last longer. Actually, Paul said awkwardly, I'd rather not. A lot of it's quite embarrassing, and most of the rest of it I don't understand. Antonia grinned in between the lines. Here's the deal, she said. You tell me the story, and perhaps I can explain some of the bits you're confused about. No promises, mind, but I've been here a very long time, and I was a partner after all. Go on, she added. If you're in a tearing hurry, I can stop time if you like. Then you can tell me the whole thing and you won't be late for whatever it is you've got to do. How's that? Paul thought for 4 seconds. Actually, he said, I'd really like that. You see, I've been living in this horrible weird place for nearly a year, and there's never been anybody I can talk to about it, well, apart from Sophie, but that was awkward at the best of times, and then she left me because of Countess Julie, and... Ooh, that sounds good. Start at the beginning, Antonia said firmly. So Paul told her the whole story, everything from the interview right up to escaping from the strong room with Colin the Goblin and watching his alter ego sword fighting with Ricky Wormtorter in the closed file stall. It all came tumbling out, every weird, baffling bit of it, all the frustration and resignation and despair, the pain of losing Sophie, the even greater pain of being himself. As he talked, steadily getting faster and less controlled, Antonia listened, not saying anything, occasionally nodding to show that she was listening and following the narrative. From time to time, the outline of her hand moved across the desktop as if she was making notes on invisible paper with an invisible pencil. As he approached the end of the story, he glanced up, and probably it was just fatigue or his imagination, but he fancied that the insides of her outline, the places where the colour would go, were starting to get just a little opaque. The view of the wall or the desk through her was very slightly blurred, like the faintest trace of mist on a mirror. And that's about it, really, Paul said at last. I was poking about, looking for Ricky Wormtoter. I wandered into this room, and now I'm stuck. A pretty silly way to end up, don't you think? For a second or two, Antonia didn't reply, and then she looked at him. Her eyes were just a sketch in empty air, but he couldn't meet her gaze for long and had to look away, and said, I think that by and large, all things considered, you've made a pretty reasonable fist of it all, Paul Carpenter. I mean, yes, she added, you've done a few bloody stupid things along the way, and yes, you have the emotional development of a walnut, and what you understand about how women think can be written on the point of a needle and still leave room for an infinite number of dancing angels. That aside, though, you've done a good deal better than a lot of people would have done in your shoes. Not that it matters much what I think, she added, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Thanks, Paul said. It helps. You're most welcome. Perhaps she flickered slightly. It was hard to tell. It sounds like you've had a rough life, all things considered. Me? Paul thought about that. Well, yes, I suppose. Or at least, well, no, I mean, I've always had enough to eat and clothes and somewhere to sleep, and it's not like I've spent my life dodging the stormtroopers or having rocks thrown at me in the street. It could have been a lot worse. And a lot better. Paul shrugged. I think it could always be better, no matter how lucky you are, and it can always be worse, unless you're dead. No offence, he added quickly. I mean... You mean, look at me, dead and still an accountant. Perfectly valid point, but you shouldn't have interrupted. I was providing moral support, making you feel better about yourself. In between the lines, Antonia was now almost grey, as though he'd coloured her in with the dirty water he'd once cleaned his watercolour brushes with. Yes, he said, you were. Kind of you. She shrugged. Nothing better to do with my time. But you were telling me about your life. Paul managed not to frown because, yes, up to a point he had, but not all of it, only the nasty, smelly J.W. bit. The entire biography was a different matter, and somehow he wasn't sure that any amount of support and sympathy really entitled her to that. "You were going to explain the stuff I don't understand," he reminded her. "So I was, yes. But in order to do that, I need more data, more of your life story." Antonia smiled again, and this time he could see more than just bare, thin lines. Grey swells of half-digested colour were coagulating in between them, like steam in a glass tube. It wasn't a face yet, not by a long way, but Paul had the oddest feeling that, when it turned into one, he might well recognise it. "For background, you see, to understand you better. I have the feeling that not many people have ever tried to understand you properly." He shrugged. "Oh, why would they want to? It's not like I'm anyone interesting or anything." "There you go, putting yourself down." The grey was just beginning to blush pink in places, rather like the grey bits on the edges of grilled salmon. "Obviously, if you go through life saying, 'I'm boring, I'm not worth bothering with,' you don't want to waste your time on me. Eventually people are going to start taking you at your word. But it's not true. You aren't just some dull, grey, featureless thing in a suit. You're a unique, different individual. Of course you aren't boring. You're fascinating." Thanks," Paul said. "But I don't think so. Nobody's ever found me fascinating in my whole life."
"I do. Not just her face and hands. On the desk between them, Paul thought he could see things. A stapler, a dictating machine, one of those page-a-day tear-off calendars, a couple of photo frames. That was, well, odd, because they certainly hadn't been there before. Maybe it was a case of his eyes adjusting to the light.
Mind if I sit down?" he said.
"Go ahead," Antonia said cheerfully. "Make yourself comfy. Do you mind if I tell you some things about yourself, Paul Carpenter? Frankly, and without pulling any punches?"
Sure," Paul mumbled. "Go ahead."
"Good. Pin your ears back and listen carefully, because this is all good stuff." Antonia's eyes flashed slightly. They were green. "You want to know what your trouble is. You're a scaredy cat. You're afraid of going out there and seeing what life has to offer because you might just get caught up in something you want to be a part of, and then you'll have to stick around. You won't be able to scuttle back to your skanky little flat and your warm little nest of self-pity. You know what people see when they look at you for the first time." Paul thought for a moment.
"Big ears?"
She shook her head, and her hair flowed around her shoulders. "Not big ears, Paul Carpenter. Not a thin, beaky nose or goggly eyes. They see what you want them to see. The face you put on in front of the mirror each morning. It's just that old effective magic. You ought to know all about that by now. But what they didn't tell you is, everybody can do it. A little bit. Everybody does it all the time without thinking, without realizing. You do this magic thing where you barricade yourself in behind a few aspects of your appearance, and you're damned if you're going to come out. Not if they lob in tear gas and stun grenades. Shakespeare said, 'Whoever loved, that loved not at first sight.' Absolutely, totally correct. It's all in that very first eyeful, and all the rest's just rationalization, interpreting at your leisure the little bits of information that you took in subconsciously the first time you saw her. Hence your maginoias, Paul Carpenter, and your carefully crafted half-witted expression. Anybody can make themselves look like a total dork. The handsomest man, the prettiest woman, if they stand in front of a mirror and pull faces for long enough, they can come up with something that nobody could ever want to love. But that's not what they want, so they don't do it. You, on the other hand..." Antonia flung out a hand in a theatrical gesture and knocked down one of the picture frames. Paul picked it up and stood it upright. "You, on the other hand, want to be a clown," she went on. "You want every female you meet to take one look at you and say, 'No, not him.' It's what we all do, isn't it? Every time we meet someone new, at that first moment of encounter, we look at them and there's a little voice in our head saying, 'Is it him? Is it her? The one?' It's only a teeny tiny moment, and then 999,999 times out of a million, the voice says no, and we forget all about it. And you put on the face that'll make them say no, because that's what you want. And why the hell do you do that? Because deep in your fuzzy little brain, 1,000,000 times out of a million, that little voice is saying yes. But you can't have them all. You know perfectly well. So you fixed it so you won't ever get any of them, and that takes care of that. I'm right, aren't I?
Slowly, Paul shook his head. Of course he was listening to what she was saying, every word of it, but right then his attention was mostly fixed on the framed photo he'd just put back on the desk. It was blank, of course, just a white piece of card surrounded by a gilded frame. No, I don't think so, he said. No disrespect and all, but I can prove it, because, you see, I really did love Sophie. Do love her, except that now you can actually have her, Antonia went on harshly. Forever and ever, no doubts, no insecurities. It's a chemically guaranteed dead certainty thanks to the love filter, which is why suddenly you'd do anything to get out of it. It's so blindingly obvious. If you really loved her, even one little bit, you'd be so thrilled she drunk the stuff, you'd be dancing on the ceiling. If you really love her, you'd know she's just right for you, and you're just right for her. All the filter does is make sure that nothing can go wrong this time round. You do see that, don't you? Sorry? Paul looked at her as if he'd just woken up. He was sure there was something about the photo, something he'd already seen, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. No, you're missing the point, he said. Drinking the filters ruined everything. It's every bit as bad as when Countess Judy blanked out those bits of her mind. It's... As soon as he said the name, the last piece dropped into place. Quickly he glanced down at the blank card in the frame, but it wasn't blank. Nor picture, but there was handwriting, flowing, squiggly, flashy sort of handwriting, the kind that looks really elegant and classy, but you actually have to squint to read the words, and the words were, "Happy birthday, sis. Love, Judy." He looked up at her again, and now all the lines were coloured in, flesh and hair and eyes, everything except the very tip of her nose, which was still faintly translucent. Now that he knew, of course, the family resemblance was unmistakable. "Excuse me," Paul said, "but do you want the Fae?" Every vestige of expression drained out of her face. "Yes," she said. "And is Countess Judy your sister?" Antonia nodded. "My kid sister, actually," she said. "And didn't it ever take you a long time to figure it out? Luckily," she added, with a slight curl of the edge of her mouth, "long enough. Thanks a lot, by the way. I couldn't have done it without you. And a gorgeous irony, of course. You murdered my sister, but you've brought me back to life. Even Stevens, you might say." She stretched out her hand, lifted up the picture frame, and put it straight. There was a picture in it now, of course. Back to life, Paul repeated. It wasn't a question, rather it was the syntactical form known only to philologists as a statement implying the term, "Oh shit. You really were dead, and now..." "That's right," Antonia said, "and in just a moment I'm going to stroll out through a door that'll magically appear in the middle of that wall, and you'll be stuck in here forever and ever, all on your own with nothing to read. Honestly," she added, "there's naive and trusting, and there's going down on bended knee and begging to be snared and drained. Soon as you came in, I knew that a little scrap of sympathy and understanding would have you by the balls. All I had to do was make it sound like I gave a toss, and out it all came, gushing like a scouser's vomit, your whole heart and soul, every last drop of you." She stood up. She was very tall. "Get a life," they said to me when I was working here, and I have, haven't I? Not what I'd have chosen, of course, she said. In fact, slumming it would be putting it mildly, but beggars can't be choosers, and it'll do to get me out of here until I find something better. Actually, I think you're such a pathetic loser that you might actually prefer it in here, in which case, enjoy. I'll be going now," she said, and at once the outline of a door began to glow sky blue on the wall in front of her. "Any last request, by the way? Just as long as it's something easy and trivial that won't put me out at all." Paul looked at her. That last bit, the tip of her nose, was almost perfectly solid, but not quite. "You're alive again," he said. "That's right. Actually, again is a bit misleading, not strictly accurate where the Fae are concerned. Right now, though, I'm most definitely alive." "And human." "Human as you are," Antonia replied jauntily. "Were, at any rate. So any small favour I can do for you?" The door was swinging open. It was ajar. It was yawning, and light was streaming through. There is one thing," Paul said. "Well?" Paul swung the rifle up from under the table and pointed at her head. "Say hello to Mr. Dowell for me," he said, and pulled the trigger. Antonia screamed as the colour drained out of her. Paul fired again, and the noise hit him like a hammer. The door began to swing shut. Paul closed his eyes, dropped the rifle, and hurled himself at her, into her, and through the open door. He hit the floor of the corridor just as the door clicked shut behind him. When he craned his head around, there was no trace that had ever been there. Instinctively, he put a hand to his face and felt his nose. It was different, smaller. He collapsed to his knees and threw up. On the other hand, he thought, once he'd finished regurgitating, she'd been right about one thing. He wiped his mouth on his cuff. "Bloody fucking Fae," he said to himself. "Why can't they just leave me alone? Now they've gone and made me kill someone. I really didn't want to do that. Not ever. Not even someone who's dead already." On the other hand, Paul stood up slowly, positively relishing the sensation of movement. "That," he said aloud, "was for implying that I'd make a good accountant." On the other hand, she had been right. He could see that now, about the barricade, the Maginot ears, the not wanting to come out and play in case the other kids were nasty to him. He'd sort of guessed it while he was being Phil Marlowe, but he'd been able to explain it away because Phil had the looks, the bone structure, the easy smile. But it had all been simple, effective magic, and Mr. Leartides hadn't actually taught him a single thing he didn't already know that day on the train. It had taken the full malevolence of the Fae to make him admit it to himself, to force him to acknowledge that life was worth taking a flying leap through his deadliest enemy for. Appropriate. Antonia had tried to steal him from himself, and hadn't he always been his own deadliest enemy? Until now. Shame, though, about his nose. Paul wondered what it looked like. Was the very tip missing, snapped off like a carrot? He tried to picture himself with a truncated snout. If only she could have taken 1/4 of an inch off each ear, she'd have been doing him a favour. The fire door, he noticed, was a foot to his left, in which case he was just up corridor of the ladies' toilet, where, because there's a grain of truth in even the most offensive gender stereotypes, there was bound to be a fully operational mirror. Normally, of course, Paul wouldn't have dreamed on any circumstance whatsoever of walking into a ladies' toilet. But he was still in Custard space, wasn't he? And he had it on the very best authority that the whole dimension was completely uninhabited, apart from a few trespassers and associates of Theo Van Spee, in which case it'd probably be fairly safe. He pushed open the door and somebody screamed. Not just any old scream either. It was like having the inside of his head rasped and sanded. Paul jumped back, slammed the door and mumbled, "I'm sorry," several times in a row. "Paul?" Of all the toilets and all the offices in all the world, he froze, caught like a rabbit in the headlight glare of her small, beady, round red eyes. Too late now to make a run for it, anyhow. She'd seen him and that was enough. He replied, "Yes?" "Paul!" The door flew open and Mr. Tanner's mum came bounding out like a stack of cans collapsing. "You bastard!" she screeched. "I thought you were dead." Well, I'm not, right? Churlish, yes, but he really wasn't in the mood to explain anything right now. And yes, I'm sorry if you got really upset thinking I died, but... Upset? She fired the word at him like a harpoon shot at a whale. "You arsehole! I went to your funeral. I cried." "I know. I saw you. But I assumed you were upset," he emphasised the word deliberately, "because I thought you were afraid of getting sued. I mean," he went on, ignoring the look of fury on her face, "if you didn't like me being dead, maybe you shouldn't have bloody well had me killed in the first place." "I explained all that," she roared, "and you weren't killed. You escaped just fine. I saw you that evening, remember, when you got back, so don't go blaming me for what happened to you." Mr. Tanner's mum paused, righteous fury disputing for possession of her mind with unbearable curiosity. "So, what happened to you then?" Paul sighed and thought, well, why not? It's a long story, but the gist is, Mr. Leartides taught me how to change how I look." She frowned. "What? He gave you fashion tips?" "Taught me how to remould my bone structure, shorten my nose, deflate my ears, all that stuff. So I did. You've been seeing me around the place every day for weeks." "But..." She stopped dead. "Philip Marlowe. You turned yourself into Philip Marlowe." Paul nodded. "Got there in the end, then." A slight sway of the torso, rolling of the right shoulder, forewarned Paul of the coming punch, just in time for him to take one step to the side, one step back. Her bald fist swung through the patch of air he'd just vacated. "You rotten, callous, thoughtless, self-centered shit," she snarled. "And hold still while I'm hitting you. You can do your shoulders in, hitting hard into empty air." "No way," Paul replied. "Holding still, I mean, I didn't ask you to be unhappy or anything. I kept telling you, no offence, but I'm just not interested that way." He could feel himself starting to go a beetroot colour around the ears. An unfortunate effect, he couldn't help thinking, given the outstanding size of the bloody things. Probably he looked like a portable sunset. Anyhow, he said sharply, "I'm not dead, so that's all right, isn't it? Look, you can shout at me all you like, but would you mind dreadfully if we did it later, because I'm actually really rather busy right now, and—" Mr. Tanner's mum made an ominous, creaky, growling sort of noise, like a huge iceberg calving. "You know what," she said, "I think I liked you better when you were dead. It's all right. Subject closed. For now, anyway." Good, he said briskly. "Right then, what the hell are you doing here, anyhow?" "Me?" She frowned. "Dennis asked me to. I'm part of the posse, hunting down Phil Marlowe for killing Ricky Wormtoter. Actually," she added, "I'm the whole posse on account of the rest of them thinking they could skip over here using a pentangle and a thummy and a packet of bird's custard powder. Told them it wouldn't work. I was right." Paul clicked his tongue. "So how did you get here then?" "Guess. All right then. I used a door." "Door?" Then something clicked in his mind. "The portable door, you mean?" "Of course. Borrowed it off little Paul Azog. I knew he wouldn't begrudge his dear old mum. Needn't have bothered, need I? If that Phil Marlowe doesn't even—" She hesitated, frowned. "Hang on," she said. "If you were Phil Marlowe all along, did you murder our Ricky?" "No, for crying out loud," Paul snapped. "No, I bloody well didn't. Nobody did. He's over here, alive and kicking, and—" Pause. "At least," he added, "he was last time I saw him, but that was a while ago now, and things may have changed a bit since then. Anyway," he added decisively, "screw him. If you've got the door with you, we can both of us go back through it, right? That's wonderful. It'll solve everything." "Like hell," Mr. Tanner's mum replied. "Haven't you been listening? Dennis has got every goblin in the building out looking for you. Wanted, dead or alive. And saying that to goblins is a bit like asking you, do you want your tea hot or cold and full of worms? Now, if Ricky really is here, we can grab him and take him back with us. And just maybe that'll convince our Dennis that maybe it's not such a watertight case against you as he thought. But you know him. I wouldn't bank on it. Otherwise, you'll just have to stay here." "No, I won't." Then he thought, "Yes, I will, because Colin the Goblin had told him that Mr. Lairtides had let Mr. Tanner in on the secret, and Tanner knew who Phil Marlowe really was." "Fine," he said wearily. "Let's go and find Ricky Wormtoter then, shall we? As a matter of fact, I was just going to look for him myself, actually," he remembered. "I was sort of planning on challenging him to a duel, but if we've got the door, we don't have to, which is nice." "So you were going to—" She stared at him. "What the hell would you want to go and do a stupid thing like that for?" "It's complicated," Paul sighed wearily. "Really, really complicated. It's a load of crap about living swords and stuff, and I think Custard and early Canadian history came into it somewhere, and Vicky the Mermaid, and a small old bloke with a round head like a melon. But with the door, I don't have to do any of that stuff. I can cheat." "Well," Mr. Tanner's mum shrugged. "Whatever. I'll take it you're employing me for my help, because, you know, you haven't got a politician's chance in hell on your own." "What? Oh, yes, right, if you're not busy or anything." Suddenly she grinned. "Anything for you, sugar muffin. You know that. All right, where was Ricky when you saw him last?" "Where was Ricky?" "Well, he was being hunted down by a carbon copy of me, armed with a living sword, and hell-bent on slicing him into little thin strips. But I got sidetracked gunning down a dead fae in cold blood, so they could be anywhere by now." Paul said.